Our speaker today is Dr. Catherine Tinker, who has many distinguished positions and responsibilities in international bodies and international law, and I don't really know where to start. But
That's all right.
But let me say that Dr. Tinker has a first law degree from George Washington University, and she is also a graduate of the New York Law School's master's and doctoral degree. And she will speak to a topic that, in my judgment, is one that really crosses European, national, transnational, and international borders. In that sense, it is a topic that is not easily located in one category or another. Is it a European Union topic, or is it also one that addresses other larger audiences? We thought that it was what would be, since we are trying to concentrate presentations on problems and issues, real world problems, we thought that we would attract a large audience. We have 30 registrants, but I'm sorry they haven't come. So Dr. Tinker will be talking about the role of the European Union and the role of business and industry, and I can imagine what that means in the formulation of goals for sustainability. And are you talking also about the politics of it? Maybe not.
The process of lawmaking.
Yeah, the nice part of it,
Yeah.
because the politics we political scientists are dealing with.
Yeah.
Please join me in welcoming Dr. Tinker.
Thank you very much.
You will be.
I'll stand up. Take some water with me. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Aldenstetter. It's a pleasure to be here. And I thank the audience for coming and your patience and for enjoying this lovely reception that you offered us. Tonight, I'm focusing these remarks on what is going on within the United Nations on Earth Day that's being celebrated here and in Europe and all over the world today. There are also meetings this week again going on at the UN, as there will be every month from now through July, leading up to the creation of what's called the new Sustainable Development Goals that do not yet exist. So with your patience, I will attempt to introduce the process, the context for this debate that's going on at the UN, who the significant players are of relevance within the EU and the business and industry community major group as that's defined at the United Nations. So I will focus everything there within the UN itself. But the issue is one that depends on all of us. And if there is to be a solution for the planet and opportunities to continue the life of all of us and our descendants, the future generations, beyond our span, we're talking now about 2030, 2050, and beyond. So this is the time frame in international environmental law, and we all have to have a lot of patience. So luckily, after I'd been practicing law for about 10 years, I had a chance to go back to NYU Law School and do my LLM. I've talked with some of you in the room who've also done that, and at NYU, in fact, too. Jim, I believe you were there. So the master's degree was a wonderful opportunity to take additional coursework, and then I stayed on for the doctorate at NYU with Thomas Frank, who had been an attorney at the United Nations. And that led me through Tom Frank and Oscar Schachter from Columbia Law School, who had been the legal counsel for the United Nations until he went to Columbia Law School. This introduction to the field, so the discipline is called International Environmental Law, and it has its own set of principles. I'll be reviewing a few of those as we go through. And so the practice of international environmental law at the UN within our discipline is also called environmental diplomacy. So this gives you the context and the focus for these remarks tonight. Okay. Now, why sustainable development goals? Bear with me for a few brief introductory slides to just have everybody on the same page and try to focus where we're going tonight. And this is to give an idea of the daunting problems facing the planet at this point. The Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, in a speech just a few months ago, commented that eradicating extreme poverty is our most urgent priority, sustainable development our guide. And this is to start off with these linkages of the idea of eradication of extreme poverty in the globe, the social and the environmental and the economic issues, all interlinked, so that no one can be solved without the others. And why is this so pressing? 2.5 billion people lacking access to basic sanitation, which is an even more pressing problem than the numbers who lack access to clean drinking water, now less than 1 million. This has been due in part to a campaign through the UN, the Millennium Development Goals, that I'd be mentioning and explaining further today. And in that goal, one of them was to cut by half the number of people lacking access to safe drinking water. And the numbers were based on a 1990 baseline. And the Millennium Development Goals began in the year 2000. They'll expire next year. So it was from 2000 to 2015. And on this one goal of the cutting the number of people lacking access to safe drinking water, that goal really was achieved even early by 2010. But all that means is that there are still close to 1 billion people who still lack safe and clean drinking water. So we have a long ways to go. And the impact on mortality, especially for those under 5, are astonishing. Something like 90% of the deaths from lack of clean drinking water and sanitation. 90% of those deaths are children under 5 worldwide. Electricity, basic. We think of all the advances today, not only through lighting, cooking, but also computer access. Imagine being without electricity. When we try to make a phone call and reach customer service, and they say, well, you can go online, go to our website. Well, for those people, 1.5 billion around the world can't do that. Another billion are suffering from hunger globally. And in the near future, in 2030, the anticipated need is 35% more food, 40% more water, 50% more energy. And the rate of urbanization and population growth means that by 2030, or by 2050 rather, 70% of the world's population is expected to be living in cities. And that needs infrastructure. So this is the nature of what the United Nations is looking at, what the world community is addressing, and what the needs are. And what is sustainable development? I think by now, since the Brundtland Commission report came out in the mid-'80s, I think that this definition of sustainable development has percolated through the culture, but this is basically the definition: development which meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And 2 years ago, in 2012, we had a conference in Rio de Janeiro, the follow-up UN conference on sustainable development, which expanded this understanding of sustainable development to emphasize the 3 pillars: the social, the environmental, and the economic pillars, all necessary and all interlinked. All right. Now, this is an overview of what I hope to cover tonight. We'll speed up soon, but the briefest of introductions just to what the European Union is doing at the UN, how it's organized institutionally. And then, since this is the business forum, I wanted to also focus the remarks on the concept of business and industry at the United Nations, because it has a very unique and very particular meaning in the deliberations of the UN. And the way that representatives of any element of civil society can enter into the work of the UN is determined in a particular way that we'll be exploring together. Then what is the UN's work on sustainable development historically? And since 1972, beginning with the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment up until now. And then the fourth item was the current process of formulating new sustainable development goals. And the process has a timetable that must be met by July this year. The group that's working on it, it's called the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals, must finish its work and report to the General Assembly by July. So it's a very short timetable left. And there is no current draft yet. So I will not be able to explain to you what it says because we don't know yet. But we must know by July, and then the General Assembly will be taking this up with the goal of having the General Assembly adopt something that will be the Sustainable Development Goals, which will come into effect in 2015 at the time that the Millennium Development Goals expire. So this is the sequence. And then in the remaining section and in the questions and a chance to talk with each of you afterwards, if you like, we can explore what some of the effects of these Sustainable Development Goals may be for international law, European Union laws, regional law, and national law, because national law will become even more important in implementing these goals, which of themselves will not have any binding legal authority. So we'll explore what that will mean. Quickly, the EU at the UN has a status that's been upgraded since 2011 by General Assembly resolution, which gives the European Union mission to the United Nations the right to make interventions, to circulate documents and statements and proposals, to present common positions from the European Union, as well as member states of the European Union, obviously as states members of the United Nations having all powers individually. So you will see on a given topic interventions by both the EU delegate and the representative of France, of Germany, of whatever other member state of the EU. The EU cannot vote as such or put forward candidates, but individual member states, of course, of the EU can. And in the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, the EU does have full participant status, and also the Intergovernmental Forum on Forests. Forests being one of the issues that are very, very important within the EU. So, and there is a permanent mission of the European Union with its own website. If you're interested, you can look online for that. And the staff at the mission represent the European Union in all matters at the UN. And it's a fairly large professional staff, at least a dozen. So it's a solid representation at the mission. Now, also for financing, the role of the EU is extremely important, not only in the issue of the Sustainable Development Goals that we're talking about tonight, but generally in the economic and social work of the United Nations. And I'm not dealing with the political side as such, Security Council matters, peace and security matters as such. I'm talking about the economic and social work of the UN, which is a large proportion, perhaps as much as 80% of the work of the UN. So that's the focus tonight. The largest financial contributor to the UN system is the European Union and its member states collectively. 35% of the regular budget, surpassing the amount that the United States contributes. We used to be, I believe, the major contributor. Certainly in the early days of the UN, the US was. 50% of voluntary contributions to the UN funds and programs annually come from the EU. And in specific areas of sustainable development, the EU has made outstanding financial contributions and had a major effect. So I just wanted to report on some of this to give a sense of how successful the efforts have been to ameliorate some of the harsh conditions for people around the world. And this is not only within the European Union, this is worldwide. 70.2 million people connected to drinking water, 24.5 million to sanitation facilities since 2004 with EU initiatives and funding. And also the protection of forests. Again, forests being a particular initiative of the EU worldwide, and trying to avoid a deforestation, to reforest, and to have nations adopt regulatory systems, sustainable forestry, and permitting and licensing systems to prevent the worst degradation of the remaining forests in the world. And protected areas for endangered species and other forms of life, flora and fauna. 1.1 square kilometer protected since 2004, along with the 1.9 square kilometers of forests. Now, I won't dwell too much on business and industry if I don't have representatives of this sector, but I would like to just stress how this term comes into being at the UN. And I think this is an interesting difference from the domestic reality, if you will. In the International Chamber of Commerce is one of the leading organizations. It would not be an individual corporation walking through the doors of the UN to come to a meeting, obviously. It wouldn't be any one of us as individuals, whether from a law firm or from a university. We would have to be a member of an organization that is accredited at the UN, a non-governmental organization that has gone through the accreditation process, and then designates certain representatives, both as annual, regular headquarters representatives to go to all meetings, and specific members who can go to an individual meeting if they're so designated. But it's through that umbrella. And in the case of business and industry, the umbrella organization is the International Chamber of Commerce, which has many, many functions in the world. But in our world of the SDGs, as we're talking tonight, they're considered one of the 9 major groups of civil society. And I have a slide coming that will show you what the other 8 are. But this is the rubric, a major group of civil society. And in this case, it's the business and industry major group. Okay. So they can come in as private sector representatives to advance positions, to make interventions, circulate statements, participate in the discussions, and organize side events during the official meetings at the UN, like any other member of civil society that is in one of these major groups. And that's how they participate. Okay. And in this way, they can advance the role of the private sector as an investor, as an innovator, and job creator. And these are key roles. The reason that the UN perhaps has understood the importance of the participation of the private sector is as a member of public-private partnerships, which are becoming more and more common throughout the world, but certainly at the UN, with the lack of funding, with the economic crisis, with the shortage of funds to put the social programs into place that are needed. The private sector is the go-to partner in these public-private partnerships. There is debate, of course, I'll acknowledge, and we can talk about this more later if anyone wishes. Some civil society representatives are very concerned that in these public-private partnerships, the private sector is setting the agenda and influencing the priorities and determining the outcomes. And whether that, in fact, is a desirable or not is open to some discussion, and we may have that tonight. But the reality is that the door is wide open and the private sector is very welcomed now at the UN. And increasingly since 1992, when there was some question about whether they should even be allowed to come into the room and sit with the other NGOs. All right, so this is a major shift. And the private sector is also funding and financing sustainable development projects and other work at the UN. In addition to the ICC, there's an umbrella organization of business and industry called this Global Business Alliance for the post-2015 development agenda, which includes as a member the International Chamber of Commerce and then a number of other organizations from the private sector, some of which you'll recognize. I not all of these initials may be known to you. The IFPMA that's near the bottom is an organization of large pharmaceutical industries, for example. Then you can see CropLife International is involved in genetically modified foods, soya beans, Roundup Ready Monsanto products, that sort of subject. And they are advocates for the position of the industries and international protection for property rights, intellectual property rights. And you can see from the names of some of the others, chemicals, mining and metals, American Sustainable Business Council, and the World Business Council on Sustainable Development. I just wanted to point out, they have a website too, if you're interested, that's worth looking at. That was founded to give a real impetus to sustainable development and bring organizations from the private sector into play in this. And they're based in Switzerland. So this, and also the Global Compact, these are voluntary groups of businesses and industries who want to work on common goals through the UN. And just to point out at the bottom, I noted that these are small and medium enterprises as well as large corporations and multinationals. So the concept now is to understand that it's the private sector in all of its iterations. Just as in other parts of civil society, if we talk about non-governmental organizations, it could be a two-person NGO, or it could be a major worldwide organization with 1 million members and regular communications in various countries. The history of the topic of sustainable development, of the development of this concept through the UN, began with the Stockholm Conference in 1972 that I mentioned, and the publication in 1986 of the Brundtland Report, Our Common Future, where the definition of sustainable development was first articulated. Then the Rio Conference on Environment and Development in 1992 was the first major world conference to use the term sustainable development. So this became part of the rhetoric and the goals throughout the UN system. And that first Rio conference was a rather chaotic, rather wonderful opening for people from all over the world. The official meetings were going on in one hall, and then the People's Conference was going on in tents by the beach in Flamingo Park, if you know Rio de Janeiro. And the outpouring of energy and concern, it's a little bit like Earth Day in Union Square Park today. You have a little bit of everything and everyone coming together, trying to figure out what does this mean and how do we achieve sustainability for the planet. So that was 92, and the document that came out of that, that became the guidepost, if you will, was Agenda 21 and the principles of Agenda 21. So that really illuminated for the world and gave some visibility to what the international lawyers had been doing, defining what those principles of international environmental law were. And many of them were working through groups like the IUCN, also based in Switzerland, the World Conservation Union, and other organizations that had been bringing scholars together. So a lot of effort from all sectors had gone into this. Then in 20 years later, 2012, we had the Rio Plus 20 conference. And for Brazil, that took great leadership in this, it was a big moment because a lot of the participation, which is a key factor in any meeting on sustainable development, became through the internet. So wherever you were, you didn't have to increase your carbon footprint. You didn't have to fly to Rio in 2012 to be part of this meeting. You could go online. There were webcasts of the meetings. There were polls. There were discussions and debates for civil society. You could send in your ideas. You could weigh in on your priorities. And all of this could be done through the internet as well. So the government of Brazil really organized all of this as host of the conference in 2012, as they had been back in 92. But this is a new level now of involvement. And what about the content? I've talked a bit about who the people are and how they get there. What about the substance from a law point of view? what is this Agenda 21? What is the document that came out of the 2012 Rio Plus 20 conference, which is called The Future We Want? What are these documents as law? Is it binding? No. They're not a treaty. It's not a consensus document that was opened for signature, as an international treaty would have to be, and then ratified by the member states or acceded to, depending on the domestic legal system. No, but what it is something we call soft law, and it creates a block of principles, of concepts, of ideas, of pledges, if you will, that the participants have agreed upon and that they feel this is what should be done, and these are the next steps for the global community. And the soft law within international law has a specific meaning, because soft law can be the basis for cooperation. Cooperation is one of the principles of international law. It's not only having the club over a state to make them comply with international law. Much of it works by cooperation. And one of our famous law professors from Columbia, Lou Henkin, in one of his books used to say that most states follow international law most of the time. And that's mostly true, and still true, except when they don't. But, okay, so this is where soft law may become the first step in creating some new international law. After a while, as a number of states in the world begin to follow these concepts, act like they think that this soft law matters and that they're going to follow it, and they do follow it often, then that may become customary law, especially if states include some of these concepts in their own national law. And they take steps based on those principles. So you have your customary law with opinio juris, your state practice, becomes binding, even as customary law. The final stage will be creation of new treaties, and then, as I say, once those are signed and ratified and the treaty is entered into force, the treaty is definitely binding international law. So all of this may be moving in that direction someday, and there could well be, in our lifetimes, a new treaty. If you ask my opinion about it, I'm a little bit cynical that I think our era of new environmental treaties and international law may be past. We had a flurry in '92. We had the Convention on Biological Diversity. We had the Framework Convention on Climate Change. And we had the Convention on Desertification. And these are all in force. They've entered into force. They've been so for 20 years. So where are we with this? I think that was based on a certain level of cooperation and consensus that led to treaty making that I believe doesn't quite exist today at the UN. So in my opinion, what we've got now is soft law. And this is the game in town right now. The more we can make soft law, it's creating new principles, it's exploring what that means, it's setting out some specific targets to achieve these goals. That's what the whole Sustainable Development Goal process is about. How do we comply with it, and then how do we measure compliance? So it's clear to everybody to see if a state has complied or not. And that's the idea, and that in fact might be more effective than a treaty that's going to have a dispute resolution provision and that will depend on going to the International Court of Justice for an opinion, and 30 more years might go by before we ever get to that point. But it can all happen simultaneously. We can follow all these tracks at the same time, so I don't mean to be discouraging on that point. But it's just to say that the emphasis, I believe, on creation of new soft law is a good one, and that it has value. And the idea that, well, you can't take a soft law document like The Future We Want into a courtroom somewhere and collect damages for failure to comply with the provisions, as you might with a treaty, it still has great value. And I think goes a long way towards addressing some of these incredibly pragmatic problems of how you get sanitation to over 2 billion people who don't have it. I mean, that's pretty down to earth. That's pretty day to day. And that's where we need this kind of soft law cooperation and agreement on the goals and the targets that will help us to reach those goals. All right. So we got farther with that by finding these two main points that came out of the Rio conference 2 years ago. The Rio Plus 20 talk was of the green economy, and in the context of poverty eradication and sustainable development. So you see that even the context has shifted. In 72, it was the human environment. Now we're talking about poverty eradication. Wait a minute, I thought this was environmentalism. Isn't this tree hugging? What happened? No. The idea is that all of these issues are so interlinked that we can't even begin to think about natural resources if we don't balance the consumption of these resources and find some kind of sustainable use of natural resources. It will continue. If we don't limit the consumption and find means of production that are also sustainable. So this is where we're going. Natural capital accounting has been discussed for many, many years, but I think it might actually be coming to the forefront now where it could be practiced more regularly and in a broader sense. That means that when a non-renewable resource is used to manufacture some product for the consumer market, that the loss of that natural resource is computed as part of the price. And in a gross national product calculation, you just can't simply look to the economic value once that product was sold in trade, that you have to take a negative against that, take a charge against it for what you did to the resource base. Okay. And institutional frameworks for sustainable development lead us to our next slide. And again, this is more of the description of what's going on this month, next month at the UN. After the first Rio conference, the organizational entity was called the Commission for Sustainable Development. It had not too much power, but it met for a number of years, as you can see, until last year. And at the Rio Plus 20 conference, states understood that we had to do something to upgrade the importance of sustainable development within the UN system, and it had to have an institutional entity with some political clout, which the CSD unfortunately did not. And therefore, this unfortunately named, but there it is, high-level political forum on sustainable development. So if you see the initials HLPF, that's what this is. It's met a few times. It will be meeting again in September. There's some meetings going on to try to plan how it's actually going to work, so I can't report to you too much yet tonight. But that is the entity, and it's been elevated. It's part of the General Assembly now, not only part of ECOSOC, which is the Economic and Social Council at the UN. The other framework, if you will, institutionally, was the Millennium Development Goals. It was a predecessor to these new Sustainable Development Goals we're trying to define, and they expire next year. Basically not successful to the extent that the ambitions had been laid out, with this one exception of the drinking water access for more people, but not yet enough, as I explained. UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program, was strengthened. Other specialized agencies of the UN are involved, including, which is an interesting development, I think, the human rights-based organizations, as well as the development programs, the UNDP. So through this meeting, the needs of sustainable development and trying to define new goals, the people who work on the development programs are suddenly talking to the people who work on the environmental issues. And the human rights people have come into the discussion too. And everybody's meeting and working together for the first time, because it's entirely different constituencies. They're different ministries within national governments, and they're different NGOs, they're different funding sources, and they're different programs. So when we say the process of defining these new sustainable development goals, I'm hoping to convey to you a little bit of the enormity of the task and the goodwill of the people who are trying to talk to one another now across these disciplines. Financing, of course, is the bottom line on many things. So there's a separate institutional entity meeting on this subject, Intergovernmental Experts Committee on Financing for Sustainable Development. There are also special rapporteurs who have been appointed by the Secretary General on themes such as water, environment, sanitation. And then the open working group on sustainable development goals. And that's going to be my focus for the rest of the time. It is part of the larger entity referred to as the post-2015 development agenda. So, and the post-2015 development agenda is being developed by UNDP as the lead agency on that, but the means of achieving that will be in part through these sustainable development goals. So it is all connected. Now, how are we going to do this? Well, the usual work of diplomacy, negotiating after drafting has been done, finding some kind of consensus, and then hopefully the General Assembly by 2015 will have adopted these new Sustainable Development Goals in a form that is comfortable to them. They may change everything that's done by July, we don't know, or they may adopt them as they come out in July. And then afterwards, monitoring and assessment to try to evaluate the compliance. And finally, as I've suggested in the process of new international lawmaking, could they become binding principles? They certainly will, to the extent of being adopted in national laws and policies. And I think that's the emphasis at this point now, because it's going to become a question of management decisions, integrated water resources management, decisions on sanitation, transport, sustainable cities. These are very much matters of national and local governments. So if the international community can provide a framework and some specific targeted goals and how to implement these ideas, then there's hope of progress. And that's how I'm trying to suggest with this example at the end. If the goal is elucidated as universal primary education, a target would be, by a certain date, 2020, all girls and boys go to school through whatever grade. That's set. And how do you measure that? More specifically, through an indicator looking at enrollment statistics or literacy rates. So it's very concrete, and that's the hope, that we can get to that point. And once this data is then accumulated, more studies can be done. It can be disaggregated by any number of categories so that we can look to see if the results are different for rural and urban, for developing and developed countries, by gender, by age, whatever category. Now, I mentioned these Millennium Development Goals. I'll zip along here, but just to show you, these were the 8 Millennium Development Goals that were to be accomplished by next year. And again, you get a sense of how these were aimed at developing countries. It wasn't something that were to be goals for developed countries, because developed countries were supposed to have been farther along on all of these subjects. But that was basically, and number 7, ensure environmental sustainability, kind of covered everything else that we're talking about tonight. So I tried to compare briefly how the two sets of goals might fit together. And the advance, I believe, from a policy point of view with the Sustainable Development Goals is that, first of all, they're universal. These are going to apply to developed countries as well as developing countries. And if nation states have already adopted national laws and policies that meet these goals, fine. Maybe they've even exceeded them in some cases. But there is work to do to make sure that they're universal. And hopefully transformative as well as aspirational, so that there could be some true progress with the ability to monitor compliance in a meaningful way. Now, also in the Millennium Development Goals, I should just point out, only states really had much say in creating those. Today with the Sustainable Development Goals, no, it's civil society. It's very broad-based participation. If you're looking for other guides, if you like drafting exercises, there are a couple of other ones you might want to look at. The first one is the true success story in international environmental law, the Montreal Protocol on ozone depletion. That worked. Those targets and timetables worked. And The Kyoto Protocol on the Framework Convention on Climate Change could potentially work. It's also attempting to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases by specific amounts by certain years. The first phase of the Kyoto Protocol has ended, and we're in the process of formulating the second phase. A few countries dropped out, like the United States and Australia in this round, China. So there's some problems. But there will be a major meeting in Paris in December of 2015 to achieve a new agreement on climate change by that date that would be universal. So there are a number of meetings leading up to this, including one in South America this year, and many meetings at UN headquarters. So keep an eye out for that. And the Aichi targets on biodiversity were created in Japan when there was a meeting in Nagoya. You might have heard of the Nagoya Protocol to the Biodiversity Convention. So these are all treaty-based, treaty-related targets and goals and timetables, but they're models. Please read for yourself this list. It's amazing. After 6 months of meetings on the Sustainable Development Goals, periodic meetings, finally the co-chairs, one from Kenya and one from Hungary, who have been excellent in this process, they created this list that summarized the discussions. Their process was to open everything up from about a year ago to discussion, to bringing in experts from various fields, to hearing what the best minds could say to the parties who are going to be negotiating and formulating these Sustainable Development Goals. What do we need? What ideas are out there? What could be accomplished? How can we reach equality and sustainability for all? And out of all those discussions, they attempted to really avoid putting anything on paper too soon. But this winter came this list, so we now have 19 themes. Everyone's got a different favorite. Everybody's got a different priority. You can't have 19 goals. And are some of these really independent goals, or are they interlinked? Are some of them subheadings under others? Can they be grouped together in some way? And how do you get down to something specific, clear, understandable, and achievable in these kinds of areas? And yet, all of this is the distillation of what we heard from experts over much of a year as what was needed if the planet is going to achieve what we need to. So here has been the most recent suggestion, and these aren't real drafts yet. This, don't think that we're that far yet along on this, but this is one suggestion for how to turn the 19 themes into a manageable number, like 8, maybe 10 when it all comes out. But that will be something like what it could look like. And number 2, gender equality and women's empowerment has been a theme throughout all of the meetings, with the understanding, as has been part of the Sustainable Development Dialogue all along, that you can't achieve any of these goals if you don't have the participation of women. And women are the ones who bear the brunt of the degradation of natural resources. They're also the ones who make decisions in villages, in cities, and families. And so if you have the involvement of women on an equal basis in the decision making and the policy formulations, then not only will you achieve your goal of gender equality, but also the empowerment of women, and that will help to achieve all the other goals. So it's constantly part of the equation to include that reference. And now the debate is, but do you make this a separate goal? Should there be a sustainable development goal on equality of women and equal participation and empowerment of women? Or do you simply put that into each one of the goals as one of the targets? Because one could measure, that could be data that could be aggregated here, or disaggregated as you choose, about the participation of women in each of the goals. If that's a subheading, if that's a target or an indicator that could be measured. So this is the kind of debate facing people right now. Water and sanitation. And that's interesting because it doesn't stand alone. Obviously, allocation of water will be one of the biggest issues for international law and for human populations. How do you allocate it between agriculture, for food security purposes, industry, for economic growth, drinking water for humans, and use for animals? How is that going to be decided? And sanitation, which will affect health and mortality rates. So each one of these, if you wish to look at them, has its own interlinkages. So I just pulled out two. There was a policy paper that was put out through the UN on these interlinkages to help us in our process. And in the focus area of water and sanitation, you can see what's been suggested. How many of those other 19 themes are affected just in that one area? And the same on economic growth. And there was this type of explanation for all of the 19 themes. So everything's interrelated, and if you see even there on economic growth, peaceful and nonviolent societies, that's one of the 19 themes. So I had said I was focusing on economic and social programs and not on international peace and security, and yet you can't get away from it, because if a society is in the midst of a civil war in a war-torn area, there will be degradation of natural resources. There cannot be provision of basic services for the human population. So it is linked. And the rule of law and capable institutions is a very important issue for business and industry, because investment decisions are made on the basis of being able to go into a country and have some kind of stability and some understanding. A contract is going to be enforceable through whatever provisions are put into the contract. The courts are going to be fair. The corruption level will be minimal enough that business can function. And that a foreign company coming in to make an investment can have some guarantee that they'll be able to function on business principles and not lose everything that they put in. So even rule of law, which in the past you might have thought referred to more election monitoring, when we send people to Iraq to stand outside the polls and try to ensure the fairness of an election, that rule of law phrase now means so much more and has all of this included in the sense of sustainable development now, and the enabling environment for business. So this is something new that I think is interesting. Who's participating? Well, obviously member states of the United Nations, the UN agencies, obviously, the Secretariat staff. And there's some very dedicated UN Secretariat professionals who've been drafting background papers, policy papers, really facilitating this whole process with the substance and the weight, and organizing side events to invite outside experts to come in as well. And then, as I mentioned, the co-chairs have been absolutely excellent in managing this process and in providing summaries after each session of the open working group, attempting not to step on anybody's toes, not to misrepresent what a particular state has said or not, trying to minimize the kind of intervention if a member state objects and says, well, no, we don't agree with that. The representative from another member state has summarized something and another delegate will object. The chairs have very skillfully, I think, tried to steer this process away from it until the point where there will be a draft and there will be real negotiations that the states will have to carry out. But in the meantime, winnowing down those 19 themes and then trying to turn them into 8 or possibly 10 sustainable development goals. The states will be the ones to vote, so they will have that ultimate decision power. And as I've mentioned, July this year, some report will be sent to the General Assembly, and they must then decide what to do with it. But also the participation of all stakeholders is incredibly important in this. It is no longer just the member states or the UN staff and agencies. It's all stakeholders, including civil society and the private sector. And here I've listed who are these 9 major groups of civil society. And again, let me remind you, this terminology comes out of Agenda 21 from 1992, from the first Rio conference. So in part, I'd like to credit Bella Abzug for this development, because she was very active in the first Rio conference for the voice of women worldwide, and she agitated, as she was very good at doing, and people listened to her, states listened, but she was an NGO representative and had no specific right at that stage to speak to the member states officially in the UN meetings. And to, I think, in part respond to Bella Abzug, the states decided, well, we better create some kind of an umbrella for these civil society groups who want to come in here and participate. And we can't just have women, so let's take 9 groups. Women can be one of those groups, and then we'll have indigenous people, local communities, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, just broadly speaking, which could be about anything as a mission. Business and industry is one of the 9, children and youth, and the scientific and technological community. Oh, and farmers. I didn't mean to miss farmers. So now at the meetings on the Sustainable Development Goals, in addition to the nameplates for the states on the desks, which indicate who wants to speak next, and they can indicate and be called upon by the chair, these 9 major groups also have the nameplates out on the desks and can be called upon when they want to make an intervention. So it's a legitimate participatory mechanism. It's been very successful. And the way that this is organized is through something called organizing partners. So each major group gets together and determines who's going to be the spokesperson, or perhaps 2 members of that major group share it. And then they take all the communications and are the bridge to the members of that major group out to the other NGOs within that major group. And that's how we get documents, that's how we understand the schedule, if there are changes, if we have an opportunity to submit documentation or to offer suggestions, it's done that way, through these major groups and the organizing partners. The private sector is one of those, as I said, business and industry, but as such, also in general, the private sector is operating under principles of corporate social responsibility. There may be a small hiatus going on in the corporate social responsibility these days due to the economic crisis, but the concept is still certainly strong and valid, and those who are coming to the UN meetings are dedicated to the concept. So not only do they practice this internally within individual companies, but also in these public-private partnerships. So there are different ways that the private sector participates, using and sharing best available technologies and technology innovations, efficient technology. And here's another benefit of the involvement of the private sector, because that's who has the ability to use new and more efficient technologies to cut, for example, emissions of greenhouse gases. So there can be achievements made, as there have been in Europe, often through the use of more efficient technology, which results in less air pollution and a healthier environment. Without taking more drastic steps, that alone can make a big difference. So, as well as financing. I just want to give credit where credit is due, and then we can have the other debates. But that's part of the position of the EU at these meetings. I wanted to pick out just a couple of topics to illustrate what some of the involvement and some of the specific emphases at our meetings you will hear from the EU representative. Forests and biodiversity, very important within the EU, projects all over the globe that achieve some of these goals. Protected areas and ecosystems, combating illegal logging, and sustainable management of natural resources. So climate change, we have mentioned, I've referred to, but there are many low carbon strategies, sorry about that typo there, strategies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And For global warming, the target, if you will, the goal now will be to have additional warming of no more than 2 degrees centigrade, which is equivalent of 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, compared to 1990 levels. So this is really significant. The science tells us that that is all the planet can tolerate. Anything above that is disaster. So that is really the outer limit. That's one of the targets that the Paris meeting will be attempting to include in the universal agreement that should be negotiated in 2015. And if it is, that would take effect in 2020. So we're thinking long term here, but it's really the outer limit of what's called the carrying capacity of the planet. So if these targets aren't met, everything's in trouble. And 2020 is probably the last date by which the scientists tell us we can make these changes before it's too late. If we haven't made them by then, any attempt after that will be so prohibitively expensive, or perhaps even impossible, that it could be too late. And if you're interested in that topic, the IPCC report just came out last week, and that's available online. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is an intergovernmental body of scientists with no affiliation to any particular position or government, and they've been making these reports since the early 90s, and the latest just came out, the third major report. So I recommend that to you. And water and sanitation, I've talked quite a bit about, so I'm going to go on to the next point. Sustainable cities. Today's New York Times has a piece about smart cities, where they're achieving reductions in expenditures and waste of resources in a novel way using computer technology. So cities like Barcelona and Copenhagen and Hamburg are using sensors in public parks to indicate when it's necessary to water. So they're not wasting water through unnecessary irrigation, spending less, therefore, to pay for the water, and conserving water resources. So it's an example, and there are many others. But sustainable cities and sustainable transport will probably be key in light of the expected rate of urbanization in the decades ahead. And then these principles, finally, of universality. These are stressed by the EU delegates in their speeches at the UN, in their interventions on the Sustainable Development Goals, in trying to create the list of the 19 themes and the winnowing process down to the 8 or 10 Sustainable Development Goals. Universality, non-discrimination, equality, transparency, participation, and accountability. And all of these are necessary. All of these would be part of sustainable development, and all of these would be part of the rule of law. So the cite I have there to one of the speeches. And just very briefly, and then I'll wrap up, the position of business and industry. Enabling frameworks and good governance are seen as necessary to promote economic growth, environmental protection, and social development. And again, rule of law, the same phrases that the European Union stresses, so that national laws and regulations are known, are transparent, are fair, are applied equally, and facilitate daily transactions so that you can encourage investments, innovation, and improve technology. So without the means of implementation, the success of any of these projects is doubtful. So every goal and every target of the Sustainable Development Goals should include some specific means of implementation. Okay. And what, finally, will be the effect on international law, EU, community law, other regional laws, and national laws? I'm just trying to suggest a few of these points so that I think we've talked at some extent about the international environmental law mechanisms. Ultimately, of course, there is the International Court of Justice, and they do hear cases that involve environmental issues. The dam built on the Danube River is one example. There are a number of fisheries jurisdiction cases that have come out of the ICJ, and the most recent decision just a few weeks ago on whaling. So there certainly is an emphasis in applying the principles of international environmental law. And within the EU as well, EU directives, the Environmental Action Program for a policy document from the European Commission, and directives that have to do with topics. For example, I pulled out something on carbon trading, which is a very interesting development within the EU. And right now there's an oversupply. So what to do if they're going to auction off allowances for carbon emissions? There's too much to auction off. So the amendment that's been proposed and approved by the Climate Change Convention is to, the Climate Change Committee within the EU, the amendment is to postpone any further auctions until 2019 or 2020, and think that by then maybe the market forces will have stabilized. So this is just an example that every good idea can run into some trouble. And it doesn't mean it's dead, and it doesn't mean it's over, it just means there has to be adjusted a bit. So I think that's where it is right now on that. Also, as far as courts go, the European Court of Justice certainly has jurisdiction over environmental questions and often hears cases, and the European Court of Human Rights as well. Nationally, there'll be harmonization of national laws for member states of the EU, of course, and a search for policy coherence, which in the area of soft law and these kinds of goals and targets we're talking about, the idea of policy coherence can become even more important than it might have been before. And finally, the post-2015 development agenda is understood to be dependent on national ownership and efforts, assisted by international support. So look for that in the future, with the addition of local governments and private sector involvement. And that's out of the IPCC report that just came out, acknowledging the need for those impacts and commitments. And what are some of the private sector sustainability initiatives? And you can see them there. And finally, transformational thinking is what's really needed now, and that is the ultimate task in drafting the Sustainable Development Goals. How can larger changes be made? What will it take? And in that sense, stakeholder values as opposed to shareholder values are being discussed. The growth model could be changed to one that reduces inequities, the famous gap that we are living through now between the haves and the have-nots that's growing, the inequality gap. Respecting the carrying capacity of the planet is a matter of science and relying on the best science to know how far we can continue to exploit resources, when we have to stop. And an end to subsidies that distort the market and trade. In agriculture, for example, commodities. Pricing of natural resources, I've mentioned already, in trying to use this natural accounting system instead of only gross national product or GDP. And payments for environmental services or incentives for reducing the impact on the environment. This is being done already in countries like Brazil. In the Amazon forest, people are being paid something by the government if they refrain from deforestation, if they don't cut down or burn the trees. They get a little payment from the government. And if they serve as forest rangers, in a way, if you will, to try to stop poaching, they also get paid for their services for ecosystem protection of the rainforest or to preserve species that are endangered. So it's just an example that this is being talked about now on an international level, that it should be done in more places and on a bigger scale. So there's something positive for reducing our human impact on the environment. And then another final thought is understanding the co-benefits, that if we make certain changes for sustainability, this will also have co-benefits on health, on lower mortality rates, on a better quality of living, and therefore also on the rule of law and the stability and the quality of life around the globe. And that would be the hope for Sustainable Development Goals. The future we want depends on participation. Again, since this was the business forum, I pulled out the paragraphs of the future we want that pertain to the private sector and business and industry. But there are paragraphs like this for other groups of civil society, for other major groups, and I brought the document with me if anybody wants to look anything else up. And if you want more information, finally, a couple of websites. This is an excellent one, the first, sustainabledevelopment.un.org. I recommend it highly. It's entertaining reading. You can find almost anything there. Policy papers are posted. You can download those. You can look up the different major groups and see what they're doing. You can see the calendar of events. The webcasts are accessible through this portal, and it's just really a wonderful tool for education and interest and involvement. It's a way to participate. Also, if any of you belong to organizations who maybe are part of an NGO at the UN, who could be one of these major groups, be involved. Go to some meetings, talk to them about what's going on here. Explore what your priorities are and what you think should be done in the UN system on these issues. The City Bar just had a program on April 3rd with some very high-level people coming from the UN and speaking on this same subject, basically, that I've been exploring tonight. And you can hear a podcast if you're interested, and download a slide presentation from a couple of those speakers. And finally, if anyone has any questions, there's an email. You can reach out to me, and I'll happily respond. Okay. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Alstetter.